Verena Brant stood on the auction house steps in the cold spring light while her own father pointed at her like a culled heifer and told the gathered town that nobody would ever want her. "Look at her," Otto Brant said, loud enough for the back row. "Too much woman and too little use. Nobody will ever want you, girl. Her worth would be measured that morning not by what she weighed, but by what she could endure. And by the end of this story, the men laughing on those steps would learn they had wagered against the wrong woman." She did not flinch. That was the first thing the quiet rancher noticed about her, though she did not know he was watching yet. Otto Brant had hauled her into the county seat on the back of a borrowed wagon, and he had stood her up on the worn pine steps of the land office that doubled as the town's auction stage, and he had announced to anyone within earshot that he was finished feeding her. A father could not legally sell a grown daughter, not even in the territory, not even in 1884. But he could shame her into anybody's keeping, and that was what he meant to do. 26 years old, broad through the shoulders and full through the hips, with flour still dusting the cuff of her one good blue dress because she had baked the bread that fed his table that very dawn, Verena Brant was being offered to the town like a debt nobody wanted to settle. A clutch of men stood near the hitching rail, and they did most of the laughing. There was Del Pruitt, who ran the feed store and had a wet, loose mouth, and there was Marcus Kane, the cattle agent in his town coat, and there was a half-grown ranch hand named Tully who laughed because the older men did. Del Pruitt called out that he wouldn't take her even to keep the flies off his porch. Marcus Kane said something lower that made Tully snicker behind his hand. Otto Brant grinned at his own audience, pleased to be the center of a joke for once instead of its target, and he gripped Verena's elbow and gave her a little shove forward as if to show off the size of his problem. Verena looked out over the muddy street and did not give them her tears. She had decided, somewhere in the long, jolting hours of the wagon ride, that she would not weep where Otto could see it. She had wept enough in 14 years of his kitchen, ever since her mother died and left her to a man who measured love by what it cost him. She kept her chin level. She kept her hands folded over her apron. And she let her eyes travel the street until they found the only face that was not laughing. He was a tall man at the far edge of the crowd, standing beside a buckskin horse with a sack of seed corn over his shoulder, and he was watching the steps with an expression she could not read. Not pity. Pity she knew the shape of, and this was not it. He had a brown, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a few days of dark stubble and a cream-work shirt gone soft with washing, and a revolver rode his hip the easy way it rides on a man who has worn it long enough to forget it. He looked, she thought, like the most dangerous man in the street. She would learn in time that he was the safest, but she did not know that yet. And so she only held his gaze for the length of one breath before Otto's voice dragged her back. "Take her for the season," Otto was saying to the crowd, wheedling now. "She cooks, she cleans, she's strong as an ox and eats like two. But she does the work of 3 hired hands. Who'll have her?" Nobody answered. The silence stretched, and it had a texture to it, the way frost has a texture. And into that frozen quiet the laughter of the men by the rail fell like gravel. Del Pruitt asked whether Otto would pay them to take her. That earned the biggest laugh of the morning. Otto's grin curdled. He had wanted to be the man telling the joke, and now the joke had a way of swinging back around toward him, the way a gate swings if you don't latch it. And his hand tightened cruel on Verena's arm. "You hear them?" He hissed at her, low and private and venomous. "You hear them, girl? This is your worth? Nothing, less than nothing. I want to stop here for just a moment before this man finishes humiliating his own child and ask you something. Wherever you're listening from tonight, a quiet kitchen, a long drive, a room where it's late, drop your town in the comments. I want to see how far Verena's story travels, because I think a great many of you have stood, in one way or another, on a set of steps like these and heard somebody tell you what you were worth. And if you'd like to follow a story where that judgment gets answered in full, stay with me to the end. Now, back to those steps and the man with the seed corn who was already setting his sack down in the bed of his wagon and starting to walk. Verena did not let her father see what his words did to her, but they did something, all the same. They struck the place that her mother's voice used to live. Helena Brandt had come from the old country with a wooden spoon worn pale and smooth in the bowl from 40 years of stirring, and a handful of recipes written in a cramped Dutch hand on a card she kept in the family Bible. And she had told her daughter over and over, in a kitchen warm with the smell of caraway bread, that a woman who could feed people would never be without a place in the world. Helena had been dead 11 years. The card was tucked in Verena's apron pocket now, soft as cloth from handling. The spoon was in the carpet bag at her feet, the only thing she had thought to bring that was truly hers. She had believed her mother. She had gone on believing her mother through every year of Otto's contempt, because a person has to believe something, and that belief was the only inheritance she had left. Now she stood on the auction steps while the town laughed, and her father told her the belief was a lie. That was when the quiet rancher reached the foot of the steps. He came up the muddy street without hurry, the way a man crosses his own yard, and the laughing men by the rail saw him, and the laughing slowed, and then stopped. There was a particular quality to how the town went silent around him. Verena noticed even in her misery a kind of careful straightening, the way men stand up a little when a creditor walks in. He stopped at the bottom step. He looked up at her, and then he looked at Otto Brandt, and he took his hat off, which no man had done that morning, and held it against his chest. "Mr. Brandt," he said. His voice was low and even, with very little weather in it. "I'm Silas Crane. I run the Crane place out past the Sweetwater Fork." Otto's eyes went greedy and bright. Everyone in the territory knew the Crane place, or knew of it. It had been the biggest spread in 3 counties once, in old Amos Crane's time. Before the hard winter of '81 killed half the herd, and the fever that came after killed Silas Crane's wife and unborn child in the same week, and the man had folded up around the loss like a hand closing, and the ranch had gone quiet and lean ever since. People said Silas Crane hadn't spoken 3 sentences in town in 2 years. People said the place was dying under him. People said a great many things, the way they do about a man who has stopped giving them anything to look at. "Crane," Otto said, and he wet his lips. "You looking for help?" "I'm looking for a cook and a housekeeper," Silas Crane said. "Wages fair, room of her own." He said it to Otto, but his eyes had gone back up to Verena, and he asked the next thing to her, not to her father, which no one had done all morning either. "You willing to work, miss?" Verena found her voice. It came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I'm willing to work harder than anyone you've ever paid," she said. "I just need somebody to let me." Something moved behind the rancher's eyes. It was gone before she could name it. He set his hat back on his head and turned to Otto, and the bargain was struck in under a minute. The way such things are when one man is desperate to be rid of a thing, and the other has decided, for reasons of his own, to take it. There was no money exchanged for her because she was not a thing to be bought, whatever Otto pretended. There was only an agreement that Silas Crane would carry her and her carpet-bag out to the Sweetwater Fork and put her to honest work for honest wages, and that Otto Brant would stop talking, which seemed to be the part the town appreciated most. Del Pruitt could not let it lie. As Silas Crane reached up to take Verina's carpet-bag, the feed store man called out one last gem for the crowd. "You'll regret it by supper, Crane," he said. "She'll eat your dying ranch right down to the dirt. Fat girl like that's a famine with feet." The street tensed. Verina felt heat climb her neck. But Silas Crane only stood there a moment with the carpet-bag in his hand, and then he turned his head and looked at Del Pruitt the way you look at a dog that has barked at the wrong man, without anger, with only a long, flat patience, and Del Pruitt's grin came apart at the edges and slid off his face. The rancher did not say a word. He didn't need to. He handed Verina up onto the wagon bench with a hand that was rough and warm and careful, and he climbed up beside her, and he clucked to the buckskin, and they rolled out of that town with the laughter dying behind them like a fire somebody had finally thought to stamp out. They rode a long while in silence. The road climbed out of the river bottom and onto the high golden grass. And the spring sun came warm on Verina's shoulders, and the territory opened up around them so wide and so empty that her own troubles seemed, for a few miles, like small weather under a very big sky. She kept waiting for the rancher to talk. He did not. He sat with the reins loose in his calloused hands and his hat pulled low and his eyes on the road. And the only sounds were the creak of the wagon and the wind in the grass and, once, far off, the cry of a hawk hunting the draws. It was Verina who broke it, finally, because the silence had begun to feel like a thing she ought to apologize for. "I'm a good cook," she said. "Whatever that man said, I can make a little go a long way. You won't go hungry on my account, and your ranch won't either." Silas Crane was quiet so long she thought he hadn't heard. Then he said, without turning his head, "I didn't ask because I believed him." Then, "Why'd you ask?" He was a while answering that too, because nobody else would, he said at last, "and I know what that's worth." She didn't understand him, not then. She filed it away with the other things she didn't understand about this strange, silent man who had walked through a laughing town and carried her out of it. She would understand it later. For now, she watched the grass roll by and let the sun work the cold out of her, and somewhere under her breastbone a very small, very stubborn thing that had been beaten nearly flat began, cautiously, to stand back up. The Crane place, when they came to it near dusk, broke her heart a little. It had been grand once. You could see the bones of it. There was a big 2-story ranch house of squared logs and milled siding gone gray for want of paint, and a great barn with a swayback to its ridgeline, and a network of corrals and a bunkhouse and a smokehouse and a spring house. All of it speaking of a time when a dozen hands had worked the Sweetwater Fork and the Crane brand had run on 3,000 head. Now the corrals stood mostly empty. A thin gather of cattle grazed the near pasture, gaunt and ribby in the failing light, and Verina's stockwoman's eye, trained on her father's hard Scrabble place, counted them and did not like the number. A young hand was forking hay by the barn, and an old man with a bad hip sat on the bunkhouse step, and that, she would learn, was the whole of the Crane outfit now. One boy, one old man, and Silas Crane holding the whole sinking thing up with his bare hands and his silence. The house inside told the rest of it. It was a man's grief made into rooms. Dust lay thick on a fine parlor nobody used. A woman's sewing basket sat on a side table exactly where she must have set it down 2 years before, the needle still threaded, and nobody had touched it. And Verena understood at one glance that this was Silas Crane's dead wife's basket, and that the man could neither use the room nor bear to clear it. The kitchen was the only living room in the place, and it was a sad one. A good iron range gone rusty at the seams, a larder near bare, a table scarred and ringed with the cup marks of solitary meals eaten standing up. Verena set down her carpetbag in the small, clean bedroom off the kitchen that the rancher showed her to, and she took off her one good blue dress and folded it away. And she put on her work dress, also blue, faded to the color of a winter sky, and she rolled her sleeves to the elbow. Then she went into that sad kitchen, and she took her mother's wooden spoon out of the carpetbag and set it in the empty crock on the windowsill where a cooking spoon belongs, and she got to work. She worked the way she breathed. The young hand, whose name was Pete, came in for the cold supper he was used to and found her elbow deep in the range, scrubbing 2 years of neglect out of its joints with sand and lye. The old man, whose name was Gideon, and whose hip had been crushed under a fallen horse a decade back, came to the door to see what the noise was and stayed to watch with a kind of cautious wonder. By full dark, she had the fire drawing clean and hot for the first time in longer than either man could say, and she had found flour gone stale, but usable, and a side of salt pork, and a bin of withered potatoes with the eyes greening, and she had made out of those poor materials a thick, rich potato soup, and a pan of biscuits that came out of that old oven, golden and high and smelling, of her mother's kitchen. When Silas Crane came in from settling the stock, he stopped in the kitchen doorway as if he'd walked into the wrong house. The lamp was lit. The range was warm. There was a clean cloth on the scarred table and 3 bowls, and a 4th one already set at the place that had stood empty for 2 years, and a plate of biscuits steaming under a towel, and the whole room smelled of food and wood smoke and something he hadn't smelled in his own home since he buried his wife, which was the smell of a place that someone was caring for. He didn't say anything. He sat down. The old man Gideon sat down, and young Pete and Verena ladled out the soup, and the 3 men ate like they hadn't truly eaten in years, which, in a way, they hadn't. Pete had 2 bowls and then a 3rd and went red when he realized it. Gideon broke a biscuit open, and steam came out, and the old man's eyes went bright and wet, and he had to look hard at the table for a moment. And Silas Crane ate slowly, his head down, and when his bowl was empty, he sat looking at it, and then he looked up the length of that table at the broad, capable woman his neighbors had told him was a famine with feet, and he said, quiet, the longest sentence he'd offered all day. "Thank you," he said. "I'd forgot what a meal in this house was like. It was a small thing. It would not have moved a person who hadn't stood on those steps that morning. But Verena Brant had stood on those steps, and had heard her father price her worth at less than nothing, and now a hard, quiet man was thanking her in his own dead, quiet kitchen for the simple act of feeding him. And the small, stubborn thing under her breastbone stood up the rest of the way and squared its shoulders. She thought of her mother's promise that a woman who could feed people would never be without a place in the world, and for the first time in 11 years, it did not feel like a lie. That night she lay in the small, clean bedroom and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of a strange house, the settling of old logs and the wind off the high grass and the distant low of the gaunt cattle. And she did not cry, though she had every reason to, because for the first time in a very long time, she was somewhere that wanted what she could do. She did not let herself hope for more than that. Hope, she had learned, was a thing that cost you, but a place to be useful that she would take and hold and earn so thoroughly that no man could ever stand her up on a set of steps and call her worthless again. The trouble was, of course, that the territory did not intend to let her earn it in peace. The first weeks were the work itself, and the work was endless and good. Verena threw herself at the Crane place the way a flooded river throws itself at a bank. She cooked 3 real meals a day, where there had been one cold one. She scoured the kitchen and the larder and the spring house. She found the kitchen garden gone to weeds behind the house, and she dug it out with her own broad, strong hands and put in what the season would still take, beans and squash and turnips and a long row of cabbages, and she hauled water to it morning and evening until her arms ached and her back was a single ache, and she slept like the dead. She mended. She rendered lard. She salted what little meat there was to be salted, and she put up the early greens. She found a milk cow gone half dry from poor feeding, and she got it back to milking, and there was cream. And then there was butter. And then there was buttermilk for her biscuits, and the men of the Crane place began, without quite knowing it, to walk a little straighter. She did all of it without being told, and that was the part that undid Silas Crane by inches, though he never said so. He was a man who had carried his ruined ranch alone so long that he had forgotten work could be shared. He would come in from a brutal day of pulling a bogged cow out of the spring mud or mending 3 miles of fallen wire single-handed, expecting the cold, dark house he had lived in for 2 years, and instead there would be light in the windows and food on the fire, and his wet coat would dry by morning because she'd hung it by the range, and the small, ordinary mercies of a tended life began to thaw the thing in him that the hard winter and the fever had frozen solid. He didn't court her. Let that be plain. He was not that kind of man, and it was not that kind of arrangement, and Verena would have laughed in your face if you'd suggested it those first weeks. She was the hired cook, and he was the master of a dying ranch, and there was a whole grief standing in the parlor between them like a third person in the house. But a thing was happening all the same, slow as a season turns. Too slow to see from one day to the next, but plain enough if you stood back. He started staying at the table after supper instead of carrying his coffee out to the dark. He started telling her things, small things, the price of beef in Cheyenne, the look of the sky, a story about old Amos Crane and a mule in his spare, flat, unhurried way. And she started learning the shape of his silences, which ones were peace and which ones were pain, and learning that the man Del Pruitt and the rest of the county had decided was strange and cold and finished was none of those things. He was only a man who had loved one thing very much and lost it, and had not known until a broad stranger lit his stove that he was allowed to be warm again. The summer fever proved her heart the way the stallion proved her hands, and it proved it to the very people who had laughed loudest. It came through in August the way the low fevers did in those years, riding in on the railhead crews and the freight wagons, and it took the children and the old folks first, the way it always did. The nearest neighbors to the Crane place were the Yoder family, homesteaders on a hard quarter section 2 miles down the Sweetwater, and the Yoders had 3 children, and the Yoder woman, Esther, had been one of the women at the market who would not quite meet Verena's eye, not cruel, only careful. A woman who'd kept her distance from the much-talked-of crane cook because the talk was ugly and she had her own standing to mind. Then the fever took all three of her children in a single week, and her husband off on the freight road, and Esther Yoder alone in a one-room soddy with three small bodies burning up and no help in 40 square miles, and word of it came to the Crane place by way of a passing rider. Verena did not hesitate, and she did not wait to be asked, and she did not stop to consider that the Yoder woman had never once spoken a kind word to her. She packed a basket, her mother's fever remedies, the willow bark and the elder and the broth that builds a sick body back, things Helena Brandt had carried out of the old country in her head, and she took the gentle black stallion. Because he was the fastest sound horse on the place and he would go for her, and she rode the 2 miles down the Sweetwater astride like a stock woman with her skirts hauled up and her basket on her arm, and she walked into Esther Yoder's dark, stinking soddy and took it over. She did not leave for 9 days. She nursed those 3 children through the worst of it on no sleep and her mother's knowledge and the plain animal stubbornness that had carried her off the auction steps. She broke the fever in the littlest one on the 4th night, sponging the small, burning body cool by lamplight hour after hour while the child's mother wept in the corner, too frightened to touch her own dying baby. And Verena did not let her be frightened. Verena put the cool cloth in Esther Yoder's hands and made her help, because a mother who is doing something is a mother who is not drowning. And that was a thing Verena Brandt understood about people that most doctors never learn. All 3 Yoder children lived. The fever took 4 other children in the county that month. In houses where no broad, calm woman came riding down the road on a black horse, but it did not take the Yoder children, because Verena Brandt would not let it, and Esther Yoder never forgot it. And the territory that gossips about cruelty also sometimes remembers a kindness. When Verena finally rode back up to the Crane place on the 10th day, gray-faced and hollow-eyed and swaying in the saddle from 9 nights with no sleep, Silas Crane was waiting in the yard. And he had been waiting, Pete told her later, a good part of every one of those 9 days, walking out to the road and back, saying nothing, his jaw set. He lifted her down off the black stallion with his 2 rough hands. She was so tired she nearly fell, and he caught her, and held her up a moment longer than the catching needed, and he looked at her ruined, exhausted face, and he did not say what a fool thing it was to ride off alone into a fever house, though another man would have, though he had surely thought it every hour she was gone. He said, lo, 3 of them lived. Not a question. He'd had the word. And Verena, swaying against his arm in the gold evening light, said 3 of them lived. And Silas Crane closed his eyes a moment as if those 3 words were a thing he needed to take inside himself and keep. And then he carried her basket in and sat her down at her own scarred table and made her, the cook, the meal, clumsy and plain, the only thing he knew how to do, which was fry an egg and pour coffee, and he set it in front of her with his weathered hands and watched her eat every bite like it was the most important thing he'd done in 2 years. And maybe it was. Pete, the young hand, worshipped her openly within a month, the way a hungry boy worships whoever feeds him. Old Gideon, who had been at the Crane place 40 years and had carried Amos Crane's coffin and held Silas as a baby, watched her with the slow warming approval of a man who had thought he'd seen the last good thing happen on that ground. You're the first thing to grow on this place in 2 years, he told her one evening, leaning on the doorframe with his bad hip, watching her pull bread. Plants and people both, "Miss, he's coming back to himself. You did that." "I made soup," Verena said, not looking up from the loaf. "You made a home out of a tomb," the old man said. Don't argue with an old man about what he can see. The first time the town got its hands on her in the flesh was the harvest social at the church, and it went the way the town intended, and then it did not. Verena had not wanted to go. She had no illusions about what waited there. But the church social was where a body sold the early summer goods and took the measure of the market, and she had cherry preserves to sell and a household to provision and no patience for hiding, and so she put on the one good blue dress and rode in with Silas on the wagon bench. And she set up her board table among the other women, and she felt the whole churchyard turn to look at the fat crane cook the moment the wagon rolled in. The women drew their skirts a little, the men nudged, and presently a knot of the worst of them gathered near her table to do, in person and at leisure, what Del Pruitt had failed to do at the market, to have the joke out loud. In front of everyone, the way easy people do when they've decided a person is fair game. It was a woman who let it, which is the cruelest way of all. Cordelia Pruitt, the feed store man's wife, sharp and thin and sure of her place, came to the board table with two other matrons behind her and looked over Verena's jars and her broad, capable self with a little smile and said, loud enough to carry, that she was surprised there was any food left to sell, given she let the given hang there. Her companions tittered, and Cordelia Pruitt added, sweeter still, that of course it must be a comfort to poor Mr. Crane to have someone out there to finish off all that food his dead wife used to make so beautifully before it spoiled, turning the dead wife into the knife, which is a thing only a certain kind of person knows how to do. The churchyard went quiet to listen. This was the moment the town had been waiting for, the public humiliation, the fat girl put in her place where everyone could enjoy it. And Verena Brant stood behind her board table in her good blue dress, with the old heat climbing her neck and her mother's spoon in the crock at home, and 11 years of Otto's kitchen at her back, and she made the choice she had made on the auction steps, the choice she made every time. She would not give them her tears, and she would not give them a fight to feed on either. She looked Cordelia Pruitt full in the face, calm as the corral, and she said, plain and even and without 1 ounce of heat, Mrs. Pruitt, I'll send a jar of these home with you for your husband. He always did look like a man who could use feeding. It was not cruel, it was barely even sharp. But it was true in a way the whole churchyard could see. Del Pruitt was indeed a soft and hungry-looking man, and the titter that had been gathering behind Cordelia Pruitt turned, just slightly, just enough, and landed on Cordelia instead, the way a joke does when the person it was aimed at refuses to flinch, and Cordelia Pruitt's sweet smile went stiff, and she did not buy a jar, and she took her matrons and her humiliation away into the crowd. But that was not the end of it, because the men were not done. Marcus Kane, the cattle agent, town coat and cold purpose, came past the table on his way to the cattlemen who'd clustered by the hitching post, and he said it low and ugly as he passed, the thing that was not meant for the women to hear, that a man like Crane, gone soft in the head with grief, was easy pickings for any clever fat girl who could cook her way into a deed. He said it loud enough for Silas to hear. He meant for Silas to hear it. He wanted to see whether the broken Crane would do anything about it, because a man who will not stand for his woman is a man you can take everything from, and Marcus Kane was in the business of taking. Silas Crane heard it. He had been at the wagon, and he came across the churchyard without hurry, the way he did everything, and he stopped in front of Marcus Kane in the middle of the whole watching social, and the cattle agent's smirk faltered just a little, and Silas said, in his low, even voice that did not need to be loud because the whole yard had already gone silent to hear it, say it again. Kane, slower, so everybody gets it right when they tell the marshal who started a thing at a church social. He let that sit. That woman nursed 3 Yoder children through the fever last month, while you sat in town counting other men's cattle. Ask Esther Yoder what a clever fat girl is worth. Ask anybody here who's eaten at my table this summer. His flat eyes went around the silent yard, unhurried, and not one person in it met them, because not one person in it had done 1/10 of what the woman behind the board table had done, and they knew it. I didn't think so, Silas said, and he turned his back on Marcus Kane, which on the frontier is the deepest insult one man can offer another and live. And he walked back to Verina's table and bought in front of the whole town every jar she had brought, and stood beside her the rest of the afternoon with his hat low and his hand never far from hers. And the harvest social, which had come to watch the fat Crane cook be put in her place, went home instead, having watched the quiet rancher and his cook stand together and not be moved. And some seed was planted in that churchyard that day that would flower, in the fall, into the whole county turning around. But the territory talks, and a man like Silas Crane taking a cook off the auction steps in plain view of half the county was a thing the county would not leave alone. Word got around, the way it does. The way it was told in town was not the way it had happened. Del Pruitt told it at the feed store with embellishments, and Marcus Kane, the cattle agent, told it in the cattleman's office with a colder purpose, and somewhere in the retelling Verina Brant stopped being a hard-working woman who had been wronged and became a figure of fun, the fat girl out at the dying Crane place. The famine with feet, eating the last of poor mad Silas Crane's ruin right down to the dirt. They laughed about it in town. They were sure of how it would end. And one Sunday in early summer, the laughter came out to the ranch to see the joke for itself. It came in the shape of 3 riders, Del Pruitt, fat and pleased, and Marcus Kane in his town coat, and a third man Verena had not seen before. Lean and sharp-faced and dangerous in a different register than Silas, with a fine horse and a finer saddle, and a way of looking at things like he was already pricing them. This was Royce Hollander, and Verena would come to know that name very well before the summer was out. He owned the big Hollander spread to the south, and he had been buying up the broke and the dying outfits of the territory one bad winter at a time, and he had his eye, everyone knew, on the Sweetwater Fork, on the Crane water, the best year-round water in 3 counties, the one thing the failing Crane place still had that was worth a fortune to a man building an empire. They rode into the yard on a Sunday afternoon while Verena was carrying a basket of wash from the line, and they did not get down, and Royce Hollander tipped his hat to her with a courtesy that was worse than rudeness. "You'd be the cook," he said. We'd heard Crane took on help. His eyes went over her, over the size of her, and a small cold amusement settled at the corner of his mouth. "Help," he said again, as if it were a fine joke, and Del Pruitt laughed his wet laugh, and the basket of clean wash sat heavy in Verena's arms while 3 mounted men looked down at her in her own dooryard and decided all over again exactly what she was worth. Silas Crane came out of the barn. He came without hurry, wiping his hands on a rag. And he stopped in the middle of his own yard between the mounted men and the woman with the wash, and the temperature of the afternoon dropped about 10 degrees. He didn't ask their business. He waited for them to state it, with his hat low and his hands loose, and that long, flat patience in him that had wiped the grin off Del Pruitt's face on the auction steps. Royce Hollander stated it smooth as cream. He'd come neighborly, he said, to make Silas a fair offer on the Crane place, water and all, before another hard winter finished what the last one started. He named a figure. It was an insult dressed as a kindness, a fraction of what the water alone was worth, the kind of number a man offers when he believes the other man is already drowning and just doesn't know it yet. And he added, with that cold amusement back at his mouth, that Silas ought to think hard. A man in his position, with another mouth to feed now, and such a large one. The yard went very still. Verena, standing there with the wash, felt the old heat climb her neck and braced herself for the laughter. But Silas Crane took one step toward the mounted men, just one, and something in the set of his shoulders made all three horses shift their feet. "You can go," Silas said. 2 words, flat and final, "and you can take the back of my neck's opinion of you with you. The Crane place isn't for sale. The water isn't for sale." And the lady, he did not look at Verena when he said it, but the word landed on her like sun, is worth more than the 3 of you put together, which I grant isn't saying much. Del Pruitt's mouth fell open. Marcus Kane's face went tight, and Royce Hollander, who was not a man accustomed to being dismissed by a neighbor he'd already mentally bankrupted, sat very still on his fine horse and let the insult settle, and then he smiled, and it was the smile of a man making a private note. "A man can change his mind," he said pleasantly, "when winter comes and the bank comes and the water freezes and the cattle die. We'll talk again, Crane. We always do." And he turned his fine horse and rode out of the yard, and Del Pruitt and Marcus Kane rode after him. And the laughter that had come to see the joke went away without it, which was somehow worse, because a man who rides away without his laugh is a man who has decided to get even. When they were gone, Verena stood a long moment with the basket of wash, and then she said to Silas's back, because he had already turned to go return to the barn, "You didn't have to say that. About me being worth more." Silas Crane stopped. He didn't turn around. "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. "Costs too much." And he went on into the barn, and Verena stood in the warm Sunday light with her heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar in her chest, and she understood that the territory had just declared war on the Crane place, and that for the first time in her life she had landed somewhere worth fighting for. What Royce Hollander said about the winter and the bank was not an idle threat, and Verena learned the size of it within the month. There was a mortgage on the Crane place. Old Amos had borrowed against it in his last years to buy blooded stock, and the hard winter had killed the stock but not the debt. And the note was held now by the territorial bank in town, and the bank's board, it happened, counted Marcus Kane and a silent partner named Royce Hollander among its number. The payment came due at the end of October, after the fall gather and the drive to the railhead, and it was a large payment, and Silas Crane had been making it the last 2 years by the skin of his teeth and the sale of the few cattle he could spare, and this year, with the herd thinned to the bone and a buyer's ring quietly closing around him, he was not at all sure he could make it. If he missed it, the bank would call the whole note, and if the bank called the note, the Crane place, water and all, would go on the courthouse steps for a fraction of its worth, and there would be exactly one bidder ready, and his name would be Royce Hollander. Verena learned all this not because Silas told her he would have carried it alone to the grave before he'd have laid it on her, but because old Gideon told her one night by the bunkhouse in the low-voice men use for bad news, because the old man could see disaster coming and could no longer do a thing about it with his crushed hip and his 60-odd years. He won't make the note, Gideon said. Not the way the herd is. He knows it. He's just too proud to say it and too stubborn to quit. He'll work himself into the ground holding this place, till the day they put it on the courthouse steps, and then it'll kill him to lose it. There's not a thing any of us can do. The old man looked at his own useless hands. I'd give the rest of my life to fix it. I haven't got the legs. Verena went to bed that night and did not sleep. She lay in the small, clean room, and she thought about the gaunt cattle and the empty corrals and the great sway-backed barn, and she thought about the man who would not say he was drowning, and she thought about her mother's promise and her mother's spoon in the crock on the windowsill. And somewhere toward dawn she stopped grieving the problem and started, the way her mother had taught her, to work it. A ranch makes its money from cattle, yes, but a ranch wastes a fortune in everything that is not cattle, and Verena Brant had been raised by a hard, poor woman to waste nothing, and she lay awake doing sums. The Crane place had a cherry and apple orchard behind a house, gone wild and unpicked for 2 years, that would carry tons of fruit by fall. It had cream and butter going to the pigs for want of a market. It had that good, year-round water and grass enough, with care, to fatten what cattle there were better than the thin, gaunt look the county had written off. It had a smokehouse standing empty. It had a woman in it now who knew how to turn poor materials into things people paid money for, who could put up preserves and dried fruit and smoked meat and crocks of butter and rounds of cheese, and who knew, from a girlhood spent at the markets of the county seat selling her father's surplus to keep his roof over them both, exactly what such things fetched and exactly who would buy them. She got up before light, and she made coffee, and she was waiting at the table when Silas came in for it, and she put it to him plain, the way he liked things put. "I know about the note," she said. He went still over his coffee. "Gideon told me. Don't be angry at him. He did right." She folded her hands on the scarred table. "I know you've got till the end of October, and I know the herd won't cover it. So I've been doing sums. The cattle are your money. But they're not your only money. You've been letting half this place rot for 2 years. Grief makes a man blind to what's right underfoot. I can fix that. Not all of it, but more than you'd think." She laid it out. The orchard, picked and dried and pressed to cider and put up as preserves. The dairy, run properly, turning out butter and cheese for the town and the railhead crews. The garden, scaled up, feeding the place and selling the surplus. The smokehouse working again. Every spare thing on the Crane place turned, by her 2 hands and her mother's knowledge, into money that did not depend on the thin, gaunt herd. Money to lay against that October note like sandbags against a flood. Silas Crane listened to the whole of it without a word, his coffee going cold in his hand, and when she was done he looked at her for a long time across the table. "It won't make the whole note," he said finally. "Not a no. A weighing. No," she agreed. "But it might make enough of it with a fair gather. That they can't call the rest. And it'll be money they can't take from you by freezing your water, because it's not in your water. It's in our hands." She had said "our" without meaning to, and she heard it land, and she did not take it back. "Let me try, Silas. I'm not asking you to believe in me. I'm asking you to let me work. That's all I've ever asked anybody. And Silas Crane, who did not say things he did not mean because they cost too much, set down his cold coffee and said the most expensive thing he'd said in 2 years. "All right," he said. "Show me." So she showed him. And the long, bright work of saving the Crane place began. The orchard was first, because the orchard would not wait. The cherries came ripe in a rush in the long days of June, and Verena went at them like a campaign. She rigged ladders and she picked from dawnlight to dusk, her broad, capable hands flying through the laden branches, and she set Pete to picking the lower boughs, and she even got old Gideon useful. Sat in the shade pitting cherries into a crock with his clever crippled fingers and grumbling that it was woman's work, while he pitted twice as fast as anyone. She put up cherries and syrup in every jar she could scour out of the dusty cellar. She dried them on screens in the hot sun. She pressed the windfalls and the bruised ones into a tart, dark juice and boiled it down with the last of the sugar into a cherry preserve so good that Pete ate a whole crock's worth of skimmings off the spoon and had to be chased out of the kitchen. And when the first batch was ready, she did not keep it for the ranch. She had Silas hitch the wagon, and she loaded the jars in straw. And she rode into the very town that had laughed at her on the auction steps, and she set up at the Saturday market beside the women who had watched her father price her at less than nothing, and she sold every jar she had brought before noon. It is one thing to be told you are worthless. It is another to stand behind a board table in the middle of the town that told you so and watch the same townsfolk press money into your hand for the work of your 2 hands and ask, "Please, would you have more next week?" The women of the town, who had laughed loudest, came back twice. Verena Brandt's cherry preserves, it turned out, were the best anyone in that county had ever tasted, because they had been made by a woman taught by a mother who wasted nothing and loved completely, and word of them spread faster than the unkind word ever had. By the 3rd Saturday she had a waiting list. By the 4th she had sold to the hotel and the railhead commissary, and the coins went into a tin box on the kitchen shelf, and the tin box began, slowly, to grow heavy. Del Pruitt came by her market table the 2nd Saturday, meaning to needle her in front of the crowd the way he had on the steps. He stood there working up to it, and then a farm wife reached past him with her money out, impatient, and told him to step aside, she was buying, and Del Pruitt found there was no room in the joke for him any more. He went away. He did not come back to the market table. There was no triumph in it for Verena, no gloating. She barely noticed him go, because she was busy, and being busy at something people wanted was the sweetest vindication there is, sweeter than any answer she could have given him. She simply outworked the laughter until there was no air left in it. The horse came to the Crane place in July, and the horse was the thing that turned old Gideon all the way around and gave the ranch hands of the county their first true reason to stop laughing. Silas had bought it cheap at the railhead because no one else would touch it, a tall black stallion of fine blood and worse temper, sold off a broke outfit that had ruined him with the whip, a horse that struck and bit and would let no man near it, a horse 3 grown bronc riders had already failed to gentle. Silas needed a stud to rebuild the herd and could not afford a sound one, so he bought the broken one and meant to make a saddle horse of him by patience, and the black stallion repaid the patience by putting Pete over the corral rail with a kick that cracked 2 of the boys' ribs, and after that even Silas, who feared very little, went into that corral the way a man goes into deep water. Verena watched it for 3 days from the kitchen window. On the fourth day, she went out to the corral in the cool of the morning before the men were up, in her faded blue work dress, and she did not bring a rope or a whip or a halter. She brought a feed bucket and an apple and her own deep stillness. And she went to the rail, and she did not go in, and she did not speak, and she just stood there, a great, calm, patient, blue shape against the wood. And she let the killer horse look at her. A horse cannot be lied to. Verena's mother had told her that in the old country way, leaning on the rail of a different corral half a life ago, that a frightened thing knows the truth of you faster than any person does, knows it from your hands and your breath and a place behind your eyes, and that you cannot pretend calm to an animal, you can only be calm. And that being calm is a thing you do with your whole body when you have decided all the way down that you will not be moved. Verena Brant had been standing calm in front of frightened and furious creatures her whole life, because she had spent 26 years being the steadiest thing in a house full of a cruel man's storms. And she had nothing to prove to a horse and nowhere she needed to be, and the black stallion, who had been screamed at and whipped and fought by frightened men for a year, met, for the first time, a creature larger and stiller than its own fear. It took her a week. She came every morning before the men. She stood at the rail, and then inside the rail, and then in the center of the corral, with her back half turned, doing nothing, asking nothing, a broad blue calm in the gold dust, until the morning the stallion crossed the corral on his own and put his great trembling muzzle into her open hand and ate the apple off her palm, and stood and let her broad gentle fingers come up the side of his neck, and shuddered once all over, the way a thing shudders when it sets down a weight it has carried too long. Silas Crane watched that from the barn door and did not breathe. By the end of the month, she could lead the killer stallion on a thread of rope and a word, and no one else could so much as touch him, and the horse that 3 bronc riders had failed and that had nearly killed Pete would follow the fat Dutch cook around the corral like a dog at her heel, gentle as morning, gentled by the one thing in his hard life that had never once lied to him. Word of that reached town faster than the preserves had. The ranch hands of 3 counties, hard men who measured a person by what they could do with stock, stopped at the rail of the Crane corral on their way past to see the thing they did not believe, the dismissed woman off the auction steps leading the unleadable horse with a word. And what they saw closed their loud mouths and opened their slow respect, because there is no faster way into the regard of frontier men than to do the impossible thing with an animal in front of them. Old Gideon, who had been 40 years with horses, watched her gentle the black stallion and took off his hat in the corral dust and held it against his chest and said in a voice gone rough, "I have not seen the like of that since old Amos's day, and I am not sure I saw it then." And Verena, brushing the great gentled neck, said only that the horse had never been mean, he'd only been afraid, and that there was a difference, and that a body who'd been beaten knew it. The dairy was next, and the dairy was steady money. Verena got the milk cow back to full flow and bought 2 more, gaunt and cheap, off a broke homesteader moving on, and nursed them up, and soon the spring house was lined with pans of setting cream. She made butter in the dawn cool and pressed it into pound rounds stamped with a sheaf of wheat she carved into a butter mold herself, and she made cheese, first the soft, quick cheeses, and then, as she found her feet, a hard yellow wheel that wanted weeks to age, and she set the wheels to ripen on clean boards in the cool of the cellar like a row of small suns. The town took every pound of butter. The railhead crews, hungry men far from any kitchen, took the cheese as fast as she could age it. The smokehouse worked again. She salted and smoked the hogs that fall in the old way her mother had taught her, with hickory and a slow cold smoke, and the hams hung in the dark smokehouse like a promise of winter survived. The garden dug and tended and doubled, fed the ranch and filled the cellar and sold its surplus at the same market table. And all of it, turned into coins. And the coins turned into the growing weight of the tin box, and the weight of the tin box turned by slow degrees through that bright, hard summer into something the Crane place had not had in 2 years, which was a chance. The biggest stroke of it, though, was the railhead contract, and she made that one herself, alone, the way she did everything. The railroad ran a construction camp 40 miles up the line, 200 hungry men laying track through country with no kitchen in it, fed badly on hardtack and worse beef by a contractor who skimmed them. And Verena heard about it from a teamster who'd stopped for her cheese, and she did her sums in the night the way she always did, and the next market day she did not go to the market. She had Silas drive her up the line to the camp, and she walked into the construction superintendent's tent with a basket of her hams and her cheese and a crock of preserves and a loaf of her bread still warm. A broad, calm Dutch woman in a faded blue dress among 200 rough men, and she set the food down on the superintendent's table and said, "Try that, and then we'll talk about what you're feeding these men." The superintendent, a hard-bitten railroad man who had been swindled by every sutler in the territory, tried the ham and then the bread and then sat back and looked at her. And a contract was struck before the bread had cooled, a standing order every week for hams and cheese and bread and preserves enough to put real food in 200 men at a fair price paid in railroad gold. It was the single largest piece of business done on the Crane place in 5 years, and it was done by the woman the county had priced at less than nothing, in a tent full of hard men, on the strength of one warm loaf and her own unhurried certainty about exactly what she was worth. And the baking, I have to tell you about the baking, because the baking was the thing that finished Silas Crane entirely, though it was the smallest thing of all. There came a morning late in the summer when Verena, up before any of them as always, baked the bread her mother used to make in the old country, the caraway bread, the bread of her whole childhood, which she had not made since she'd come to the Crane place because the materials were dear, and she'd been hoarding the rye. But the contract money was in now, and the harvest was good, and she had a sudden ache that morning for her mother's kitchen, and so she made the caraway bread. And the smell of it filled the whole house the way it had filled her childhood, warm and dark and strange and unbearably homelike. And Silas Crane came in from the dawn chores and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway and breathed it in, and his hard, flat face did a thing Verena had never seen it do. It came apart, just for a second, just at the eyes, and he had to put his hand on the doorframe. He did not explain it. He didn't need to. Some smell had reached down into him past 2 years of grief and 20 years before that, to a boy in old Amos Crane's kitchen, to a mother of his own long buried, to the simple animal memory of being small and safe and fed in a warm house, and the broad Dutch woman at the range had done that to him without trying, with a loaf of bread. And Silas Crane stood in the doorway of his own home and was, for one unguarded breath, undone, Verena saw it. She did not say a word about it. She only cut him the heel of the loaf, the best piece, and buttered it thick, and put it in his hand, and turned back to the range to give him his moment in private, because she understood by then exactly what the man was, and exactly what he could not say. And she had decided somewhere that summer that she would spend whatever years she was given saying it for him, in bread, in soup, in light in the windows, in all the wordless tongues her mother had taught her. Silas Crane watched it happen and was changed by it. He was not a man to say so. But Verena saw it. She saw it in how he started carrying the heavy jars without being asked, and how he built her a proper drying rack and a second smoke shed without a word when he saw she needed them, and how he took to lingering at the orchard in the evening, cool to pick the high boughs she couldn't reach. The two of them working the same tree in a companionable quiet while the light went gold and the swifts cut the air overhead. She saw it in the supper table, which had become the warm heart of the day, the four of them, the ranch family that had assembled itself out of the wreckage, eating her good food and telling the day's small news. Pete's chatter and Gideon's dry stories and Silas's spare, rare humor that had begun that summer to come out of hiding. And she saw it most of all the evening she found him in the parlor. She had never seen him go in there. None of them did. The parlor was the dead wife's room, the threaded needle and the untouched basket, the grief made into a space. But she passed the door one evening, and he was standing in the middle of it in the dusty light, very still, holding his wife's sewing basket in his two hands and looking at it. Verena stopped in the hall. She didn't speak. After a while, Silas said, without turning, in a voice scraped low, her name was Annie. She'd have liked you. She always said the house was too quiet. He set the basket down, not where it had been, but in a drawer, putting it gently away, and he stood a moment with his hand on the closed drawer, and then he turned and saw Verena in the hall, and something passed between them in that dim parlor that neither of them had words for and neither of them tried to name. He had put the basket away. He had let the room be a room again, and Verena understood that she had not just lit his stove. She had thawed the man. But understanding a thing and saying it are two different countries, and Silas Crane lived in the first one and rarely traveled to the second, and Verena had learned not to ask for words from a man whose every action spoke. She told herself she was the cook. She told herself the warmth in her chest when he handed her down from a wagon or saved her the choice cut at supper was the simple gratitude of a woman who had been given a place to be useful. She told herself a man like Silas Crane, who had buried a wife he'd loved like Annie, would never look at the fat girl off the auction steps and see anything but a good worker. And she had no business wanting more, and she packed the wanting away the way he'd packed away the basket, in a drawer, gently, with her hand resting a moment on the closed face of it. The town, of course, had decided the wanting for them, in the ugliest possible way. Because here is what the territory said that summer. While Verena Brant was outworking every cruel word that had ever been said about her, the territory said she had trapped him. It said the fat girl had wormed her way into poor mad Silas Crane's grief in his kitchen and meant to have his ranch, that she was no honest cook but a schemer, fattening herself on a widower's loneliness, and that when the place went under, she'd have his name and his water both. Royce Hollander seeded that story carefully, the way a careful man seeds a fire, because a man who could not buy the Crane place outright might yet take it, by ruining the people on it, and Marcus Kane, the cattle agent, watered it in the cattleman's office, and Del Pruitt, sour over his lost joke, carried it everywhere with relish. The whole shape of it was designed to do one thing, to make Silas Crane doubt the only good thing that had happened to him in 2 years, to poison the well, to turn the quiet warmth of that ranch family back into the cold and the dark, so the place would fall and the water would come up for sale. And it nearly worked. There came an evening in late August when Silas rode back from town, gone strange and cold, the old frozen look on him for the first time in months, and he was short with Pete and silent at supper, and he did not linger at the table, and Verena lay awake in the small room with her heart sinking, sure that the town had finally said the thing that turned him against her. She did not know yet what had been said. She only knew the warmth had gone out of the house like a banked fire someone had thrown water on, and she lay there in the dark and thought, with the bleak certainty of a woman who had been disposed of before, that she had been a fool to let herself unpack the wanting even into a drawer, and that she would be put out on the road by morning. The fat schemer the town had warned him of, and that her mother's promise was a lie after all. It was nearly midnight when she heard him at the kitchen table. She came out in her shawl, because she could not lie there and wait for the morning to break her. He was sitting in the dark with a cold cup of coffee, the lamp unlit, the moon through the window laying a pale square on the scarred wood. He didn't look up. For a long while neither of them spoke, and the old kitchen ticked and settled around them, and her mother's spoon stood in its crock on the sill in the moonlight. "They told me a story in town today," Silas said at last, his voice flat and careful. "About you, about what you're after." He turned the cold cup in his hands. Hollander's story. Pruitt's mouth. The whole county's by now. Verena's throat closed. "I know what they say I am," she said. "Do you?" "A fat schemer," she said, and made herself say it level, the way he said hard things, trapping a grieving man for his land. They've been saying some version of it since the steps. She lifted her chin in the dark. "I won't defend myself against it, Silas. If 2 months of my work in this house hasn't told you what I am, no words of mine are going to. You either know me or you don't. I'm too tired to beg a man to know me." The silence after that was the longest of her life. Then Silas Crane did a thing she did not expect. He laughed, once low, scraped, but a real laugh, the first she'd heard from him. "That's about what I told Pruitt," he said. Word for word, near enough. He set down the cold cup. "I didn't come back cold because I believed them, Verena. I came back cold because I wanted to put my fist through Royce Hollander's face in the middle of the cattleman's office, and a man who does that loses everything he's got left, and I've got too little left to lose any of it." He was quiet a moment. "I came back cold because for the first time in 2 years there's something here I can't stand the thought of losing. And that's a hard thing for a man like me to carry into a room full of men who've decided to take it from me." Verena stood very still in her shawl in the moonlit kitchen. "I'm not good at the words," Silas said low. "Annie used to say I'd let the barn burn before I'd holler fire. So I'll say it the plain way, which is the only way I've got. The town's wrong about you. They're wrong about every part of you. And whatever happens with the note and the bank and Hollander, whatever happens to this place, I'd be a poorer man than my own ruined ranch if I let them make me believe their story over the one I've watched you live every day in this house. That's all. That's the whole of it. Go back to bed." It was not a confession of love. It was nowhere near it. But Verena Brant went back to her small room with her heart so full she thought it would crack a rib, because a hard, quiet man who hated words had sat alone in the dark, waiting to tell her that he knew exactly who she was, and that he was not going to let the laughing world tell him otherwise. And the warmth came back into the house by morning, banked but burning. And the work went on, and the tin box on the shelf grew heavier, and through it all, unspoken, in the spaces between the chores, the thing that had started on the auction steps went on quietly becoming what it was always going to become. The harvest of the home field came in September, and it was the first time the whole reduced family of the Crane place worked a single job shoulder to shoulder, and Verena would hold the memory of it all her life. Silas had put in oats and a little wheat in the spring, more from habit than hope, and the good water and Verena's tending had brought it in heavy. And there was no money to hire a crew, and no crew to be had in any case, so the four of them cut and stacked and threshed it themselves, Silas swinging the cradle scythe down the long gold rows in the heat, Verena and Pete binding the sheaves behind him as fast as he could lay them, old Gideon sitting on a stool at the threshing floor doing the close work his crushed hip allowed. And the four of them moving down the field together under the big white September sky from first light to last in a rhythm that needed no words. Verena worked the binding as hard as any man, her broad, strong back bent to it hour after hour, her hands flying through the stalks, and she did not flag, and she did not slow, and Silas, looking back down the row to find her always there, always keeping pace, always steady behind him, felt a thing settle in his chest that he had no name for, but that any married man of 40 years would have recognized at once, the deep, plain, animal contentment of a man who has found the one other person who will pull the load beside him and never let the corner of it drop. They ate dinner in the field, the four of them, on a quilt in the stubble in the noon shade of a single cottonwood, Verena's bread and cold ham and a jug of buttermilk gone cool in the spring. And there was a half-hour of rest there, the work half done, and a gold straw all around them, when nobody spoke and nobody needed to. When Pete lay back with his hat over his face and Gideon dozed against the tree, and Silas sat with his forearms on his knees, looking out over the field his father had broken, and Verena sat beside him close enough that their shoulders touched, and the whole hard world for 1/2 hour was exactly the size of that quilt and exactly that good. When they stood to go back to it, Silas put his hand under Verena's elbow to help her up. She did not need the help, and they both knew it. And he held her arm a beat longer than the helping, and he said, looking out at the field and not at her, in the flat, plain voice he used for the truest things, I never thought I'd bring in another harvest on this ground. I'd quit thinking past the next bad winter. He let go of her arm slowly. You gave me back the next year, Verena. Nobody's done that for me before. And then he went back to his scythe, because that was as far into the second country as he could travel in daylight, and Verena stood a moment in the gold stubble with her heart pounding. And then she bent her broad, strong back and went back to the binding, and the four of them brought in the harvest of the Crane place before the light failed. The first full crop in 3 years, stacked gold and safe against the coming cold. But the calendar does not care about the slow warming of 2 careful hearts, and October was coming. And Royce Hollander had decided to stop waiting for winter to do his work for him. The fall gather went well, better than well, because Verena had fed those gaunt cattle, and Silas had nursed them, and the herd that came off the high grass in September was fatter and sounder than anything the county expected of the dying Crane place, and the drive to the railhead brought a fair price, more than Silas had dared hope. He came home from the railhead with the cattle money, and Verena added it to the heavy tin box of the summer's preserves and butter and cheese and smoked hams, and they sat at the kitchen table one night in October and counted it all out by lamplight, every coin, twice. And when they had counted it twice, Silas Crane sat back and was quiet. And Verena's heart climbed into her throat, because she could read his silences now, and this one was the silence of a man looking at a thing he hadn't believed he'd see. It was enough, not with a fortune to spare, but enough, the cattle money and the summer's careful coins together, enough to make the October note in full, to pay the Territorial Bank every dollar owed and keep the Crane place whole and the water out of Royce Hollander's hands for another year. The thing the whole county had been sure was impossible. The thing old Gideon would have given the rest of his life to fix and couldn't. The broad dismissed woman off the auction steps had built it with her 2 hands out of cherries and cream and salt pork and refusal, one heavy coin at a time. "We did it," Verena whispered, and there were tears standing in her eyes that she let stand this time, because they were the right kind. "Silas, we made it." "You made it," Silas said, and his own voice was not quite steady. "I'd have lost this place a dozen times over without you. You know that. The whole county knows it, whatever else they say." He reached across the scarred table and laid his rough, warm hand over her broad, capable one, the first time he had ever touched her. That was not the brisk courtesy of handing her up or down. And they sat like that a moment in the lamplight over the tin box that held the saved ranch, and it was, Verena thought, the closest thing to a proposal a man like Silas Crane might ever manage. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world. Which was, of course, exactly the moment the territory chose to try to take it all away. Royce Hollander had watched the Crane place refuse to die all that summer, and a man like Hollander does not simply wait to be beaten. He had built his empire on the certainty that broke men stay broke, and the Crane place was making a liar of him in plain sight of the whole county, and as October came on, he stopped being patient about it. The pressure came in small, ugly increments, the way it does from a man too clever to be caught. A stretch of the Crane fence along the south line was cut in the night, and a good piece of the gathered herd drifted off onto the open range and had to be hunted back at the worst possible time, days before the drive. A rumor went through the railhead that the Crane cheese was tainted. Started by no one anybody could name, and for a bad week the commissary stopped buying until Verena rode in herself and made the commissary sergeant eat a wheel in front of his men, and the rumor died of its own foolishness. And there came, on bank stationery, a cold formal letter reminding Silas Crane that the October note would be enforced to the day and the dollar, with no grace, no extension. No mercy, signed by the board, which is to say signed by Marcus Kane and somewhere behind him, Royce Hollander. Silas read that letter at the kitchen table and set it down very carefully, and Verena watched the old frozen look try to come back into his face, and she did a thing then that surprised them both. She reached across the scarred table and put her broad hand flat over the cold bank letter, covering the words, and she said, "Let them. We've got the money, or near it. Let them be as cold as they like. Cold doesn't pay a note. Coins do, and we've got coins." And Silas Crane looked at her broad, capable hand spread over the threat that had haunted him for 2 years, blotting it out, and something in his shoulders came down out of the cold, and he turned his hand over under hers so they were palm to palm on the table over the buried letter, and he held on. It was that same week, in the low gold evenings of the gather, that he finally told her the whole of it about Annie. Not the scraped half-sentences of the parlor, but the whole of it, sitting on the porch step in the dusk with the worked-down day around them. Because a man who is about to risk everything on a note tells the truth while he still can. He told her about the hard winter of '81 and the cattle dying in the drifts, and Annie carrying their first child through it, and the fever that came in the spring thaw and took them both in the same week, the wife and the child unborn, and how he had buried them under the cottonwood by the spring and folded himself shut around the wound and let the ranch and himself go to ruin together, because he could not see a reason in the world to keep either one standing. "I thought that was the end of me," Silas said, looking out at the dark coming down over the saved fields. "I thought a man only gets the one. I'd made my peace with being a dead man who hadn't gotten around to lying down yet." He was quiet a while. "Then your father stood you on a set of steps and told a whole town nobody would have you. And I stood at the back of that crowd and I thought, there's a thing the world has thrown away that's worth more than the whole town that threw it. And I didn't know I was alive enough to think it until I'd already thought it. You woke a dead man up, Verena Brandt, and I don't half know what to do about it. And that's the truth I've been carrying around all summer like a stone in my boot." Verena did not answer that with words, because there were no words in her big enough for it either. She only moved a little closer on the porch step until her shoulder rested against his arm, the broad, warm, solid fact of her, and they sat like that in the dark a long time. Two people the world had broken and thrown away, leaning their separate wounds together until they made, between them, something that could almost stand on its own. Neither of them said the word for it. It did not need saying. It was in the leaning. It happened the night before the note came due. Silas was to ride into town the next morning with the money, the whole of it. The cattle money and the summer's coins both, carried in the heavy tin box and a leather satchel, enough to pay the territorial bank in full and keep the Crane place whole. They had the money counted and ready on the kitchen table, and there was a kind of careful joy in the house that evening. The joy of people who have done an impossible thing and not yet quite let themselves believe it. Pete had gone to bed grinning. Old Gideon had said grace over supper for the first time anyone could remember. A short, rough country grace, thanking the Almighty and, in the same breath and the same tone, thanking the Dutch girl, which made Verena laugh and Silas almost smile. And then the house had gone quiet, and the lamp was low, and that was when the dog started up in the yard. It was not the bark of a dog at a coyote. Verena had been a stockwoman's daughter long enough to know the difference. This was the high, frantic alarm of dogs at men, and it came from the direction of the barn, and a heartbeat later there was the unmistakable orange flicker of fire against the kitchen window, and Pete was shouting down the stairs that the barn was burning. The barn was burning, and the careful joy of that evening went up like dry hay. Royce Hollander had not come himself. A man like Hollander never does. But the three men who came out of the dark with torches and pistols had been sent by him as surely as if he'd signed the order, and they had come to do a simple, vicious thing, to burn the Crane barn with the winter hay in the wagon and the saddle stock in it, and in the chaos and the smoke to take the satchel of note money that the whole county knew Silas Crane would be carrying to the bank at dawn. Burn him out, rob the money, and let the bank call the note on a man with no barn, no hay, no winter, and no payment. It was the kind of plan that works, that had worked all over the territory on broke and beaten men with no one to stand for them. But the men who rode out of the dark that night had not reckoned on Verena Brant. The barn was the crisis only she could solve, and she solved it, and this is the part the county would tell for 30 years. Because while Silas and Pete ran for the burning barn to fight the fire and free the screaming horses, and old Gideon hauled himself out on his bad hip with a bucket, the three raiders did exactly what they'd been sent to do. Two of them peeled off in the smoke and confusion and came for the house, for the kitchen, for the satchel on the table, while their fellow kept Silas and Pete pinned at the barn with the fire and a pistol. They came through the kitchen door with their faces masked and their guns out, expecting an empty house and a box of money, and they found instead a broad, strong, furious woman standing between them and her mother's spoon and a saved ranch. And Verena Brant did not scream, and did not faint, and did not freeze. She had been salting beef all that week, and the heavy iron salting vat and the long butcher's flensing knife were where she'd left them by the door, and Verena Brant, who had hauled water and lifted hogs and lugged 100 crocks of preserves all that long summer, was the strongest person on that ranch and very possibly in that county. And she used it. She put her shoulder into the heavy kitchen door as the first man came through it and pinned his gun arm crushing against the frame so the pistol fired wild into the ceiling, and she took up the iron skillet off the range still warm from supper, and she struck him with the flat of it so hard he went down and did not get up, and she turned with the skillet to the second man. The broad blue bulk of her filling the doorway, lit red by the burning barn, and the second raider, a hired tough who had burned out 3 families and never once been fought, took one look at the size and the fury of her and ran. He ran into the dark and the smoke, and he kept running. And he was the one who later, drunk and shamed in a saloon 4 counties over, told the story that made Verena Brant a legend, that he'd robbed a dozen ranches and never run from a man yet, and he'd run from a Dutch cook with a frying pan because she came at him like a barn falling on a man, like a thunderhead that had put on an apron and meant business. She did not chase him. She had the satchel to mind, and a man down at her feet, and a barn on fire, and a household to save. And she did all of it the way she did everything without being told. She dragged the unconscious raider out into the yard and tied his own hands with the wash line and left him for the law. She carried water. She got the milk cows and the saddle stock out of the corral away from the smoke. And when Silas and Pete and Gideon, with their faces black and their hands burned, finally beat the fire down to smoking ruin, they had lost half the barn and most of the hay, but saved the house and the stock and the standing posts. Silas came staggering out of the smoke looking for her, hoarse, terrified, calling her name in a voice none of them had ever heard from him, because the last raider had told him as he fled that his men had gone for the house. And Silas Crane had spent the worst 3 minutes of his life since the fever sure that he had lost a second woman to the cruelty of the world. And there she was, standing in the red firelit yard, sooty and torn and magnificent, the satchel of money over her shoulder and a tied-up outlaw at her feet, and her mother's iron skillet still in her hand, alive, whole, hers. And Silas Crane crossed that yard and took her by the shoulders with his burned, shaking hands, and looked at her like a man looking at a thing he'd been certain was taken from him, and he could not speak at all. He had no words for it. He never would. He just held onto her shoulders in the firelight and shook. And Verena set the skillet down and put her sooty arms around the hard, quiet man and held him while he shook. And over his shoulder she watched the barn burn down, and she was not afraid, because the money was safe, and the family was whole, and the worst the territory could throw had come, and she had stood in the door of her own home and thrown it back. The law that came out the next morning was the territorial marshal, and he was not in Royce Hollander's pocket, which Hollander had badly miscalculated. The raider Vrina had felled talked freely to save his neck, and he named Hollander and named Marcus Kane, who had told them which night the money would be in the house. And the whole rotten plan came out in the cold daylight, with the barn still smoking behind it. It is a long matter, the law, and it would be months grinding toward the day Royce Hollander stood in a courtroom in the county seat and was sent to the territorial prison for arson and attempted robbery, and Marcus Kane with him. And Del Pruitt, named as the gossiping errand boy he'd been, and run out of his own feed store by neighbors who'd finally had their fill of him. But that is the law's slow story, and it is not really the story I am telling you, because the story I am telling you is about a woman's worth, and the worth was settled that night in the firelit yard, not in any courtroom. Because Silas Crane rode into town the next morning, exhausted and burned and grim, with the satchel of money Verena had saved with a skillet, and he paid the territorial bank the October note in full, every dollar, on the day it was due. And the bank could not call it. The Crane place was whole. The water was theirs. Royce Hollander's empire had broken itself, in the end, against the one thing it had been too arrogant to count, the broad, dismissed woman the whole county had laughed at on the auction steps, who had turned out to be the strongest, the bravest, and the most necessary person in 3 counties. The town reversed itself, the way towns do, with no memory of ever having been otherwise. The women who had laughed on the steps now told the story of how the Crane cook had fought off 3 of Hollander's raiders with a frying pan and saved the ranch and brought the whole wicked syndicate down, and in the telling she grew until she was 12 feet tall. And they were proud, suddenly, to have her preserves on their shelves, proud to nod to her at the market. Proud as if her worth had been their idea all along. Verena let them. She did not gloat. There was no gloat in her. She was too busy and too kind and too tired for it, and she did not throw the steps in their faces, though she could have. She simply went on selling them the best cherry preserves in the county and let her work go on being the answer it had always been. The vindication was complete, and it was quiet, and it was hers, and she did not need to say a single word of it aloud. The frying pan and the paid note had said it all. The barn raising was the truest measure of the turn, because a frontier county does not lend its hands lightly. Word had gone out that the Cranes were rebuilding what Hollander's men had burned, and on a bright Saturday in late October they came, not a few, but the whole valley, wagon after wagon, rolling up the Sweetwater Road with men and tools and timber and women with covered dishes. Because that is how the frontier says it is sorry, without ever once using the word. Esther Yoder came at the head of the women, Esther, whose 3 children Verena had pulled back from the fever, and she walked straight up to Verena in the busy yard and took both her hands and said, in front of everyone, loud enough to carry, "These hands kept my babies in the world. There's not a woman in this valley going to say a word against them again, and the one who tries answers to me." And the women who had laughed at the market and drawn their skirts at the social stood there in the yard with their covered dishes and had the grace, most of them, to look ashamed, and then they did the only honest thing left to do, which was get to work. They fired Verina's range and laid out a barn-raising dinner for 60 under her direction, taking her orders in her own kitchen, the fat crane cook, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, which by then it was. The men raised the barn frame in a single day, the great pale timbers going up against the autumn sky to the call of the master framer and the ring of 40 hammers. And at the noon of it, they all sat down at long plank tables in the crane yard and ate the best meal any of them had eaten in a year. And they knew whose food it was, and more than one hard man who had laughed on the auction steps in the spring sat at those tables in the fall and could not quite meet the eye of the woman who had fed them. Verena fed them anyway, every one, and asked for no apology, because the food was the only answer she had ever needed to give, and it was answer enough. But there was one thing left unsettled, and it was the only thing that had ever truly mattered, and it was settled 3 weeks later, in the orchard, in the low gold light of a fall evening, by a man who had finally come to the second country, the one where things are said. The barn was being rebuilt. The neighbors had come, all of them in the way of frontier people once they've decided which side they're on, and there was a great half-raised barn frame standing new and pale against the autumn sky. The note was paid. The danger was past. The Crane place, against every prediction of the county, was not dying, but living, was greener and fuller and warmer than it had been in old Amos's day, and everyone knew exactly why, and her name was Verena Brant. And on this particular evening, Verena was in the orchard pulling the last of the late apples, up on a ladder, in her faded blue work dress with her work-worn bun coming loose, and her broad, capable hands full of fruit. Doing the simple, honest work that had been her whole answer to a world that told her she was worth nothing, and Silas Crane came and stood at the foot of the ladder and held it steady for her the way he always did, and did not say anything for a while, the way he always did. Then he said, "Come down a minute." Verena, she came down. She stood in front of him in the gold light with her apron full of apples, and Silas Crane took his brown hat off and held it against his chest the way he had on the auction steps the day he first saw her, the only courtesy he knew, and he looked at her, this hard, quiet man who would let the barn burn before he'd holler fire, and he did the most expensive thing he had ever done in his life. He went down on one knee in the orchard dirt. He knelt in front of the broad dismissed woman the whole county had laughed at, the woman who had saved his ranch and his family and quite possibly his life, and he held his hat against his chest, and he looked up at her with everything in him at last come up to the surface where she could see it, and he said, in his low, even unhurried voice that had never once said a thing it did not mean because, "It costs too much. I'm no good at the words. You know that by now, so I've only got the plain ones." He drew a breath. "You came here because nobody else would have you. I want you to stay because there's nobody else I'd have. Not the cook, not the help. You, Verena Brant, stay here. Be my wife. Belong to this place that you saved, and to the man who'd be ruined and dead and frozen without you. I've waited my whole life to find somebody worth coming back to life for, and it turned out to be a Dutch girl with a frying pan that nobody in this county wanted but me." His voice cracked just at the end, just once. "Stay, please. I'm asking you to stay." And Verena Brant, who had stood on a set of steps in the cold spring light and heard her own father tell the gathered town that nobody would ever want her, stood in the warm gold orchard with her apron full of apples, and looked down at the good, hard, quiet man kneeling in the dirt in front of her, asking her, the fat girl, the famine with feet, the less than nothing, to stay, to belong, to be chosen, openly, before the whole reversed in Watching County, and she did not faint, and she did not freeze, and she did not weep, or not only weep, she set down her apron full of apples gently in the grass, and she reached down and took the kneeling man's burned rough hands in her broad capable ones and drew him up to his feet, because she would not have him kneel, not to her, not to anyone, not ever, and she said the only word that mattered, the word that answered the auction steps and the laughing town and her father's cruelty and her mother's promise and 11 years of believing something when there was no reason left to believe it. Yes, she said. I'll stay. I was always going to stay. You're the first person who ever asked me instead of telling me. And the answer was always going to be yes. And she kissed him, there in the orchard, in the gold light, with the new barn pale against the autumn sky, and the saved ranch spread out warm and living all around them, and old Gideon, who happened to be watching from the bunkhouse step because old men miss nothing, took off his own hat and held it against his chest. And young Pete whooped fit to scare the crows out of 3 counties, and the territory, which had been so very sure of what a woman like Verena Brant was worth, was proven wrong about the whole of it, forever, in a single fall evening, in the warm and ordinary glory of a man kneeling in the dirt to ask the woman the world had thrown away to please, please stay. They were married in the new barn before the first snow. It was the whole county that came, which tells you everything about how a place can turn. The same neighbors who had laughed on the auction steps now filled the raw timbered barn with their best clothes and their wedding gifts, and the women brought food but stood back a little shy of bringing food to Verena Brant's wedding of all the kitchens in the territory. And the great new barn that Hollander had tried to burn was hung with lanterns and autumn boughs, and smelled of fresh pine and roasting beef and Verena's bread. She wore the one good blue dress, the very one she'd worn on the auction steps with a flower on the cuff, because she would not buy a new one and would not be talked out of it. Let the dress that had been stood up to be sold be the dress that was stood up to be chosen, she said, and Silas, who understood her by now better than he understood anything, did not argue. Old Gideon gave her away, hobbling proud and slow up the length of the barn on his crushed hip with the Dutch girl on his arm, because there was no father worth the name to do it, and the old man had earned the office twice over. And her mother's wooden spoon, the worn pail spoon that had crossed an ocean and stirred 40 years of caraway bread and stood in the crock on the crane window-sill all that long, bright saving summer, was tucked into the ribbon at Verena's waist, because her mother had promised her, in a warm kitchen long ago, that a woman who could feed people would never be without a place in the world. And her mother had been right. Her mother had been right all along. It had only taken 11 years and a long, cold ride and a quiet rancher to make it true. Otto Brandt was not there. He had not been asked. He came around the ranch once, that winter, when word reached him that his cast-off daughter was now the mistress of the largest saved spread in 3 counties, and the most spoken of woman in the territory, and he came with his hat in his hand and a wheedle in his voice, and a story about how he'd always known she was destined for great things. How he'd done her a favor, really, putting her in Crane's path. And Verena met him in the dooryard, the same dooryard where Hollander had looked down at her from a fine horse and called her help. And she did not rage at him, and she did not gloat over him, because there was no rage or gloat left in her. She had buried it under a winter of being loved. She only looked at her father a long, quiet moment. The way Silas looked at a dog that had barked at the wrong man, and she said, "You told me nobody would ever want me. A man wanted me enough to kneel in the dirt and ask. You were wrong about the one thing you were ever sure of." And then she had Pete give the old man a basket of preserves and a smoked ham, because her mother would have. Because a woman who can feed people feeds even the ones who don't deserve it. And she sent Otto Brandt back down the road with food he hadn't earned and an answer he'd never forget. And she never saw him again, and she did not grieve it. The Crane place thrived, I'll tell you that much, because I think you've earned it, and so has she. The water that Hollander coveted watered the greenest grass in the territory, and the herd that Verena had fattened grew back to something near old Amos's day, and the orchard she had saved fruited heavier every year, and the dairy and the smokehouse and the garden she'd built into a second fortune ran on long after they no longer needed to. Because Verena Brandt did not know how to waste a thing or stop working, and she did not want to. There were children, 3 of them, 2 boys and a girl, all of them broad and strong and dark-haired and unafraid, and the girl was named Helena, after the grandmother she never met, the grandmother whose spoon stood in the crock on the windowsill where Verena's daughter would learn one day. In a kitchen warm with the smell of caraway bread, that a woman who could feed people would never be without a place in the world. And it would be true for her, too, the way it had finally come true for her mother. Because some promises only have to be kept once to be kept forever. Silas Crane never did get good at the words. That was all right. He had said the only ones that mattered, on one knee in the orchard dirt in the gold light, and he spent the rest of his life saying the rest of it the way he said everything, by holding the ladder steady, by carrying the heavy jars, by putting his rough, warm hand over her broad, capable one across the scarred kitchen table in the lamplight, by being every single day for the whole of a long life. The safest man in a hard country for the woman the country had thrown away, and on winter nights, with the snow piling soft and white against the windows of the house that was no longer a tomb, but the warmest home in 3 counties, with the children asleep and the fire low and her mother's spoon a pale shape on the moonlit sill. Verena Crane would sit in the parlor that was a parlor again and feel the broad, strong arm of her quiet husband around her shoulders, and she would think sometimes of a cold spring morning and a set of pine steps and a town that had laughed. And she would not be bitter and she would not be sad, because the laughing was a long way off now and very small, like weather under a very big sky. She would only think, with a deep and settled peace that no man could ever take from her again, that her father had been right about exactly one thing and wrong about it at the same time. Her worth had been measured that morning, just as he said. It had been measured not by what she weighed, but by what she could endure. And she had endured everything. And out the far side of all of it she had built, with her own 2 broad, capable hands, a life so full and so warm and so wanted that the small, frightened girl on the auction steps would not have dared, in her wildest hope, to dream it. Now I'll leave it with you the way I leave every one of these, with a question, because I'd truly like to know. If you'd been in that town on the day Otto Brandt stood his daughter on the steps, if you'd been standing at that hitching rail, would you have laughed with the rest of them, the way easy people do? Or would you have been the one face in the crowd that wasn't laughing, the one who saw, before anyone else did, exactly what that woman was worth? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're listening from, because Verena's story has traveled a long way to reach you tonight, and I'd dearly love to know just how far. Thank you for staying with her all the way to the end. She'd have wanted you to know it mattered that you did.